In this clip, I want to introduce you to what we call the business cycle. So what we do know over time, when we've looked at the actual data in terms of economic activity, which we'll measure with our statistic of GDP, is that it actually goes up and down. So it actually refers to economic fluctuations in business activity. Now, the short term, or what we call these fluctuations, we believe are primarily caused by changes in C plus I plus G plus NX. And the combined level of spending, remember, is going to determine a particular level of production, which in turn will require a level of employment, etc. So again, we're making that connection, that key connection between spending and production and jobs. So in our last clip, we suggested that, let's say that total spending had to be at a certain level to achieve what we call full employment. So, for example, we can imagine that in the lead up to this point, then C plus I plus G plus net exports was actually increasing. So if we reach what we might call a peak, we could actually sometimes say that economic activity is booming. And what we would expect to find, we'd expect that consumer confidence is high, therefore consumer spending is high, willingness to borrow is high, businesses are responding accordingly by also borrowing and acquiring new capital equipment and in expanding their plant in order to accommodate higher levels of consumer activity. So we'd expect a high level of employment here, so that's a good thing, but be wary. High levels of production requires that more and more resources be employed, and what we do know is that sometimes in some markets resources start to become relatively more scarce, and the competition between the buyers for those resources starts to pull the prices up. So we can actually get a sense of a bit of a nasty outcome here, and we'll call it correctly, we'll call it demand pull inflation. So demand is so high that it's actually calling forth a level of production the economy is not geared up to handle, and competition between buyers for resources is starting to pull those prices up. Now, I posed the question, what if spending wasn't at that what we call the full employment level? Well, what we'd expect, of course, is that the level of output would fall. So you can imagine yourself in business, if the level of demand for your product wasn't as high as what you anticipated, then how would you be aware of that? Well, there'd be a big build-up of inventory over there in the back of the warehouse. Stocks are piling up, and at some stage you say, gee whiz, I better cut back on production. And you say, well, you guys over there, I want you to take 6 weeks off and don't come back till I call you. So you start to lay people off and cut back on production. So as you cut back, economic activity starts to fall. So what we can identify here is what we call a downturn in economic activity, and we're heading towards, if you like, a slump or a trough. Some journalists refer to this as a recession. Technically, a recession is when you actually have 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic activity, so you'd be below the line here for over 6 months, but we'll just call it a slump or a trough. And what we can observe is that, again, over time, and we're not exactly sure how this happens, but it does happen, we actually get or start to experience what we call a recovery. Now, what we will be looking at in one of our clips is how this recovery might be aided and stimulated by the government taking a more proactive role in stimulating economic activity on its own, or through judicious interest rate adjustments to actually encourage higher levels of borrowing. But so stand by for that one. But what we find is that over time we can see another period of expansion taking place. So as economic activity picks up and up and up and up, we head towards another peak. So over time, we've got this cyclical nature of business activity. Now, very roughly, in Australia, we can look at perhaps the last 2.5 decades, and we recognise that, give or take a couple of years, that our business cycle takes about a decade. But other research has shown that on average, over the business cycle, over a longer period of time, that these contractions in economic activities, these downturns, these slumps, if you like, average about 19 months, whereas periods of expansion over the last 50 odd years average about 32 months. So what we've got here is what we call a business cycle. Now, remember that down here we suggested that if you're in business, one of the reactions here would be to cut back on production. So, and one of your immediate things which we discussed when we were looking at firms' reaction in, say, in micro, you'd actually lay people off. So what we find is that down here there's an increase in what we call unemployment, and specifically it's an increase in, not surprisingly, cyclical unemployment. So this is technically what we call demand deficient unemployment. So total demand is insufficient to call forth a level of output that requires everyone who wants a job to have a job. So what you'll find is your textbook refers to two other types of employment as well. One is frictional. People are in between jobs, actually voluntarily they've quit a job, anticipating that another one will come about. And there's another nasty one which we've seen emerge. It's called structural unemployment, where there's a mismatch of skills, or where companies, for example, have restructured and they've actually laid off and retrenched large amounts of staff because they're getting the work done offshore. Or, for example, we've seen it where large motor corporations are closing Australian factories and you're gone. All that skill set is no longer required. So that's another issue we need to address a bit later. So what we find is that this has been fairly evident throughout economies like Australia. And economies like Australia have developed what we call some recognisable, explicit and sometimes implicit, what we call macroeconomic goals. So clearly what we'd like to think is that the economy ideally should provide a job opportunity for everyone that wants a job. So full employment is a highly desirable outcome, largely because, I've got to tell you, that is not a good outcome. So you've got rising levels of anxiety, depression, you've got rising levels of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, crime, divorce rates. It's just bad. This is bad. This is a bad situation. So we really want to avoid that if we possibly can. Now, we'd like all this to happen, would you believe, in an environment of price stability, because what we find up here, when we've got rapidly rising prices, when there's an increase in what we call the general price level, we've got inflation. And this is equally bad news. Bad news particularly for people who are on fixed incomes, because it reduces their purchasing power and impacts severely upon their standard of living. But George and I will talk about that a bit later. So we want all this to happen in an environment of price stability. We like to think that over time we get rising standards of living which are attributed to economic growth. Ideally, we'd also like to think that we are maintaining a sound relationship, if you like, in terms of our relationships with our dealings in exports and imports with the rest of the world. So external viability would be good. Just take that bit out there. Plus, of course, equity, something that George and I have talked about a little bit. And of course, something which is really dear to everyone's heart, I hope. And that, of course, is environmental sustainability. Now, where our focus will be to help you to understand how we might help the economy achieve, in particular, these outcomes through judicious use of government intervention. So make sure you watch the clips on what we call monetary and fiscal policy.